This crowd is so beautiful to see. You know, we saw maybe in that monthly magazine about Todd coming, but I didn't see anything in front of that dining room, you know, that would remind us. But this is it. This is the greatest tribute you can give to Todd. So we might as well start. For over 200 years, Thomas Jefferson has been the most admired and revered of our founding fathers, second only to George Washington. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Todd DePastino, America's national educator, who will be offering insights and reflections on the Sally Jennings controversy, a topic that has sparked both concern and conversation in our community. Todd is uniquely suited to tackle this nuance and with an integrity because over the years, you know he has earned this reputation for balancing compassion with clarity, bringing depth and thoughtfulness to very complex issues. His approach is rooted in listening carefully, discerning facts from fiction and other narratives, and engaging hearts and minds, even when discussions become difficult or divisive. Tonight, Todd will guide us through the key elements of the controversy, the central claims and responses, the broader implications of our institutions and relationships, and possible paths forward grounded in justice, understanding, and healing. Let's open our hearts and minds to what he has to share. I invite you to join me in welcoming the one and only Todd DePastino.
I've got to say, man, that has to be the most thoughtful, kind introduction I've ever had. Apologies, Pam. I mean, so wonderful. I think it's especially important for tonight because tonight's is kind of an adult-themed lecture, and I'm just trusting you all are adult enough and mature enough to handle it. No. About 25 years ago, a controversy over Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his slave Sally Hemings emerged kind of in the public discourse and attracted a lot of discussion and debate and controversy. And it's that controversy I want to address and talk about tonight. And I think of it as it's a controversy that the accusation was that Thomas Jefferson fathered 6 children with his teenage slave, Sally Hemings. And that accusation was true. And because of the revelations about his relationship with Sally Hemings, it's fundamentally changed how we view Jefferson. And I'm thinking of this talk as a kind of coda or addendum to our series on Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the national villain, was the villain of our founding story for generations and generations. And Jefferson was the hero. And then in 2004, something strange happened. This book came out, a wonderful biography by Ron Chernow, a biography of Alexander Hamilton. And then that inspired about 10 years later this wonderful musical about Alexander Hamilton. And it fundamentally switched kind of the historical reputations of these two men, Hamilton and Jefferson. Their stories are so tightly intertwined. There's Jefferson on the left from the musical, Hamilton on the right. Their stories are so tightly intertwined that it's almost impossible to tell the story of one without telling the story of the other. Jefferson was Hamilton's key antagonist, his key adversary, and it's the rivalry between the two men which really drove Hamilton to his greatness. And they're really, as I said, their kind of historical reputations are related and bonded to each other as if by a law of physics. The reputation of one can only rise if the other one falls. You know? It is like you can't have them both. You know, one has to, and I really think the Jefferson controversy which happened 5 or 10 years it started to emerge before Hamilton's popularity. I think the Jefferson controversy was a necessary precondition for the renaissance in Alexander Hamilton that we experienced beginning in 2004. In other words, Alexander Hamilton would never have become the celebrity founder that he has become without first the fall of Thomas Jefferson's historical reputation. And we should remember that for hundreds of years, Thomas Jefferson, just like Mim said, was the great hero of our founding story, second maybe only to George Washington. I mean, he was, for many, many Americans and generations of Americans, the most beloved founding father. And then around the turn of the 20th century, 21st century, something happened. And they switched. And Jefferson's reputation went down, Hamilton's reputation went up. And I remember very well, probably around the time that the musical was coming out, my younger daughter coming home from school, and it would have been like 9th grade, maybe 8th grade. She came home from school because she knew that I admired Thomas Jefferson. And she said something like this, maybe not so directly, but it was something like this. That founding father that you love so much was a creepy hypocrite. Or a hypocritical creep, something like that. And boy, was that a great thing. It just opened up this great conversation that kind of we still talk about today because, we talked about the importance of separating a person from their achievements, an artist from the art. I mean, Pablo Picasso was one of the great awful people of history, but he did wonderful art, I mean, Martin Luther had a bad side to him, for sure. Albert Einstein, just tortured his wives. You have, all these kind of great people in history who have these really dark sides to them. And it's important, I think, to keep both in mind as you're assessing somebody's, historical reputation or contribution. But boy, have the scales tipped against Jefferson. And I mean, it was shortly after this conversation with my daughter Libby that I began to see those words like hypocrisy and creepiness over and over. This is from the New York Times. Jefferson, the patron saint of hypocrisy. 14 painful reminders that Thomas Jefferson was kind of an awful person. 14 disgusting facts about President Thomas Jefferson's private life. Thomas Jefferson is one of the most deeply creepy people in American history. Agreed. And this is my favorite. It's from a podcast called Behind the Bastards. Part 4, Thomas Jefferson, King of Hypocrites. And so the opprobrium that has been heaped on Jefferson over the past 20 years almost makes us forget just why he was nearly worshipped for so long. What qualities Jefferson possessed that made him such a hero to so many Americans for so long through the 19th and through the 20th century. And it's largely because Jefferson embodied the very qualities that Hamilton lacked. You'll remember Hamilton. Hamilton was overtly ambitious. He had powerful ideas. He believed in those ideas. And his goal was to have his ideas influence this new country as much as he possibly could, which meant he had to hold high office, he had to have power. And he was overt in his desire for power, which makes him, I think, relatable today, but it makes him unacceptable to 18th century gentlemen. To be a gentleman in the 18th century, especially to be an American, a virtuous American, you had to forswear any interest in power or control. The office had to be offered to you 5 times before you would accept it. No, I couldn't possibly run for president. No, I don't want to. And then you pay people to beg you to run for president, and then you run. That's what Jefferson did. He was great at portraying himself as a modest, virtuous farmer. He was really good at it. He was also discreet in a way that Hamilton was not. Alexander Hamilton, we said this so often, had crazy ideas and harsh criticisms of other people. That's fine, but you're never supposed to say them out loud. And he did. He stated his crazy ideas. He eviscerated people publicly. And you do not do that in 18th century politics. Jefferson never did that, ever. He had the good sense to pay people to do that for him, you know? Pay them to publish an article with a crazy idea. Pay them to publish a book criticizing your opponent. That's what Jefferson would do, but he would not sign his name to it. So he had this discretion that made him acceptable and admired in the 18th century, but it was especially the power of his ideas. I think, and this is probably a cynical way to put it, but let me put it this way, because I think it'll get my point across. Thomas Jefferson was really good at flattering the American people. Really good at flattering them, because he told the American people time and again, you have built the greatest society on earth. You have founded a virtuous republic, the likes of which has not existed since ancient Greece or Rome. You have created a political system where only the virtuous rise and rule in the disinterested mode that's required for good government. That we have the best government on earth, we're the best people on earth, and we should work to preserve the virtue that we've cultivated here. He was idealistic about politics. He believed, Jefferson really believed, and I think I would disagree with him on this mostly. Jefferson was quite romantic about human possibility. He thought that it was possible to create a society where citizens were largely virtuous. He thought if you created a state that was structured on virtue, you could generate generations of Americans who lived virtuous lives. And he thought that that's what we were doing. He really did. He thought that we were really going to become this virtuous republic. He was idealistic about politics. Hamilton never was. Hamilton was deeply cynical. Hamilton had a much darker view of human nature. And Hamilton had a much more cynical view of politics. To Hamilton, politics was about power. It was about exercising power, blocking your opponents from it, making alliances to increase your influence. That's what politics was about, no matter what form of government you call it, whether you call it a parliamentary system or a monarchy. Politics essentially was about power. Jefferson did not believe that. The other thing that Jefferson embraced that Hamilton really didn't embrace is Jefferson believed, we need a couple more seats, don't we? If anybody has an empty chair, if you want to see, we have empty chairs around here. If you want to come, and I hate to see you, because I got to warn you, I'm going to go long. Jefferson really believed that the best people on earth and the best kind of society on earth that you could have is an agrarian one. He believed that the best people were small farmers. And it just so happened 90% of Americans in 1790 were small farmers. So he was telling the American people, you guys are living the best kind of lives that you could live so that we could create the best kind of republic that we could create. In other words, he was truly flattering the American people left and right, telling them, he was telling people, the American people left and right, that this was, small farmers were the best building blocks to create a virtuous republic. Hamilton, you'll remember, told the American people pretty bluntly, your small farms are cute, but they ain't gonna build a big, powerful global power off of small farms. You build a global power from cities and manufacturing and growing populations. That's what happens. And so you would think that through the 19th century, the Jeffersonian vision, truly the romantic Jeffersonian vision of this country as a small, virtuous, agrarian republic, that vision kind of inspired us through the 19th century, carried us into the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, something happens to this country. We become Hamilton's country. We industrialize. We urbanize. Waves of immigrants come to work for wages in factories. We become a global power in a way that we had never been before. And you would think that Jefferson's reputation then would wane and Hamilton's would rise because it's so obvious that we've become Hamilton's country. But that's not what happened. Oddly, in the 20th century, Thomas Jefferson received this huge boost in his historical reputation. I mean, it was in overdrive. Jefferson became more popular in the 1930s than he had even been in the 19th century. And it was largely from the effort of President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt promoted a cult of Jefferson very deliberately to revive Jefferson as our apostle of democracy. And he didn't so much hint as say that he was the inheritor of the Jeffersonian mantle, that he was the 20th century embodiment of the Jeffersonian vision. It was FDR who put Jefferson on the nickel, replacing the Indian head. It was FDR who had the Jefferson Memorial built in the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. It was under the New Deal that Jefferson was put on Mount Rushmore. Jefferson was also put on the first-class postage stamp during the 1930s. This was really the beginning, or it was a high period of this Jeffersonian revival that lasted really almost through the very end of the 20th century. And I can remember growing up in my home, on my bookshelves, my parents' bookshelves at home, this 6-volume biography of Jefferson by Duma Malone. My mom claimed to have read every word, and she urged me to read it. I read about 10 pages. This book, I think Dumas Malone began it in the 1940s. The last volume was published when I was in high school, so it took him, 30 or 40 years to write this. And I do remember in the opening pages, he has this stark sentence: "Our democratic tradition stems from Jefferson, corruption and deficits from Hamilton." That is as stark as it gets. And I think the Dumas Malone 6-volume set, which is wonderful, by the way, I have since then at least read a volume. It's wonderfully written and it's wonderfully researched, with a lot of blind spots, of course, but it's a wonderful book, and I think it's the greatest expression of this Jeffersonian Renaissance that the country went through in the mid 20th century. And for somebody like me who loved books, loved learning, loved reading, when my parents took us to Monticello, I absolutely came back completely loving Thomas Jefferson. How could you not? The guy was a genius. And we really, I think Mim used that word, and it really is a word. It's kind of like the word hero. You don't want to throw that word around too much. Genius is kind of one of those words, but he qualifies. He absolutely qualifies. He was unbelievable. He was involved in so many things. He was an expert in so many things. He was an architect when there were no architectural schools in America. He taught people architecture after teaching himself engineering and architecture. He was an attorney who taught other people the law. He knew science. He knew literature. He knew philosophy. He was really something else. This guy, he had this he coupled this great cognitive ability with this deep curiosity about the world. He once said he was curious about every blade of grass, And he kind of lived that way. He was curious about everything, about music, about art, about literature, you name it. One of his biographers said, Thomas Jefferson could calculate an eclipse, survey an estate, tie an artery, plan an edifice, try a cause, break a horse, dance a minuet, and play a violin. And that's all true. He did invent some things. Most often he perfected things that had already been invented. One thing that he actually did invent from scratch was this cipher wheel, which later became the basis for other decoding machines later in the 19th century and even early 20th century. He invented the cipher wheel because he was having a problem, and a lot of Americans have this problem, a lot of people around the world had this problem, of when you put something in the mail in the 19th century or late 18th century, you had to assume that somebody was going to open it, read it, copy down the contents, put it back in the envelope, and send it on its way. Because things he'd write in confidence to people would show up in newspapers later. I mean, it was just routine. So he developed this cipher wheel, and he had a few built for people who he was going to correspond with and transmit sensitive information. He invented this cipher wheel to deal with it. This is a rod, and there are little wooden dials, 20 of them or so, that are kind of jammed together on the rod. And on the outside of each dial is the alphabet in random order. So what you would do, and these were all identical, these cipher machines, what he would do is he would spell something out that he wanted to write, line up the letters, so this says, Cool Jefferson Wheel Cipher. And then he would send a string of other letters that you had to line up to get that one to appear. And he would send that in the mail. So this is something, he dreamed up. This is a solution to the problem that he had. And I must say, here's another example, the moldboard plow. He perfected this. He didn't really invent it. But Jefferson and Franklin was like this also. Jefferson and Franklin were both in an era, and I don't think we're in this age now, that the smartest people on earth were not studying abstract philosophy. They were not studying what the equivalent of particle physics. They were truly focused on trying to solve everyday problems that humanity faced. Problems like lightning and fire and farming. They were very practical in where they focused their effort, and that was very much by design. They were trying to improve humanity. The swivel chair, something that he invented, the polygraph. He called it a polygraph. We might call it an auto pen. This was something that really was used, and he made other versions of this for other people. So he could write a letter, and another pen would be connected to the pen that he was writing with, and that other pen would make a copy of the letter that he was writing. So he would always have a copy of the letter that he had sent. But what Jefferson was I think what Jefferson was proudest of, what he thought was his greatest achievement at the end of his life, and what other Americans most remembered him for, was of course his authoring the Declaration of Independence. He had been tasked with writing a breakup letter to Great Britain in June of 1776. The Continental Congress gave him that task. It was really intended simply to state that the United States was now separate, and here's why. A breakup letter. Jefferson took this opportunity to make a crazy, wild, radical statement about human rights and human freedom. And I think we forget just how striking these words are that he wrote. I'm kind of stunned that the Continental Congress allowed this first sentence of the Declaration of Independence to remain in the Declaration. We hear it so often, we don't, I think, allow the words to move us as deeply as they could. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. he's saying that all human beings are equal and that everybody has a fundamental God-given right to freedom. This is extreme. This is extreme for the day. And it seems like, and it would dawn on the delegates long after the July 4th, it would dawn on the delegates that, wait a minute, this goes a little too far. This goes too far. All men are created equal? That everybody has equal rights to liberty? We do have commentary of some of the people who were in the Continental Congress kind of wishing that they had struck these words from the Declaration. In the 1920s and 1930s, or 1820s, 1830s, you could go through the American South and have a hard time finding these words in public copies of the Declaration. And I've often wondered why this was allowed to remain in the Declaration. And I do think it's related to the fact that in addition to this sentence, and the sentence that followed, in addition to this, Jefferson wrote about 200 or 300 words directly condemning slavery in very direct, graphic language. This is indirect, this is abstract, this is high-minded. But he spent another 200 words, 300 words directly condemning slavery. And I do wonder if he was savvy enough at age 33 in 1777, if he was savvy enough to know that if he put those 200 or 300 words in the Declaration, they would attract the attention of those Southern delegates. And they will get struck. And this, in comparison, might be left alone. Because that is what happened. Those words condemning slavery were crossed out. They were never part of the final document. This was allowed to stay in. And I think it was because this was so indirect, it was so broad. Jefferson would later, not much later, say publicly, time and again, this is about slavery. He made this statement to be about slavery, and it's one of his first. He would go on through the 17th, through the War of Independence and late after, he would go on to condemn slavery more eloquently than anyone, and I'm going to say this, I don't think this is much of an exaggeration, if it is an exaggeration. Thomas Jefferson in the 1770s and 1780s condemned slavery more eloquently than anyone on earth. I think if Jefferson had had the good sense to die in 1786, he would have been remembered as the greatest champion of human liberty of the era. He would have been remembered as the great critic of chattel slavery. But Jefferson lived another 40 years. And over the course of those 40 years, the last 30 of which, he said almost nothing about slavery. Almost nothing. He was outspoken and eloquent in his condemnation of slavery in the 1770s and 1780s. And then, after he became president, he fell silent about it. And it's such a curious thing, and it's such a striking thing. But before he fell silent, he said things like this, and this is probably one of his most famous passages from his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. The man must be a prodigy who could retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. And with what execration should the statesman be loaded, who permits half the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the other? Can the liberties of a nation be thus thought secure? I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. I think a change already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution. The spirit of the master is abating, and that of the slave rising from the dust, preparing for a total emancipation. Very optimistic, very much a faith in kind of divine justice. And very much, this is very much in concert with the prevailing anti-slavery views of the 1780s, which was this. Slavery is so obviously unjust. It's so obviously damaging to the people who have to live in submission to it, and obviously damaging to the slave owners themselves, that it cannot possibly last. It has to kind of disintegrate before the rise of public enlightenment and reason. It just has to. That was the prevailing view. And of course, Jefferson wrote this as a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson owned 600 slaves over the course of his life. He did not emancipate them. He emancipated, I'm not sure how many he actually emancipated. He certainly emancipated 4 of his slaves. Another 2 he allowed to run away, and another unknown number he may have permitted to escape or encouraged them to escape. So that's maybe 8 or 9 slaves out of 600. His other hundreds of slaves, they were slaves. I mean, he had a reputation, certainly, as a kind and benevolent slave owner. Monticello had a reputation as a, it was not a charnel house of brutality the way that some plantations in Virginia were. He believed in positive reinforcement. He believed in paying slaves for good work. He believed on being very sparing with the whip and the rod, although whips and rods were used against his slaves. They were slaves. If they ran away, he put out an order to have them captured and returned. This is one of his longtime slaves, born at Monticello, Isaac Granger Jefferson. He was considered perhaps the best tinsmith and blacksmith in all of Virginia. And this is an indication of kind of Jefferson's treatment of his enslaved people. He liked to select slaves with high intelligence and educate them as best as they could with skills that could be marketable in the wage labor market. But if slaves ran away, the order was to go out and catch them and bring them back. Here's a notice that he put in a newspaper in 1769 of a slave named Sandy who runs away, and it's offering a reward for his return. He's a runaway, a mulatto slave called Sandy, about 35 years of age. His stature is rather low, inclining to corpulence, and his complexion light. He's a shoemaker by trade, in which he uses his left hand principally. So it's showing, trying to describe this person. So if you see him, you could grab him and bring him back. He can do coarse carpentry work, is something of a horse jockey. He's greatly addicted to drink, and when drunk is violent and disorderly. In his conversation, he swears much. So it goes on and on. Sandy was caught. Sandy was returned, and Sandy was sold by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson did sell slaves as young as 3 years old from their mothers. I mean, this was a brutal business. It was a brutal fact of reality of life on a southern plantation. And Jefferson participated in it as a member of the plantation elite. Unlike Washington, he never made a provision to emancipate his slaves. And that is largely because he couldn't afford to. Jefferson was always, his whole life, in debt, deeply in debt. He was a terrible businessman. Have you ever known anybody who's smart on the one hand and really dumb on the other, with practical decisions? He was terrible if Thomas Jefferson should ever come back to Earth and invite you to invest in one of his schemes, saying politely decline it, because every one of his business ideas was a terrible disaster. Building Monticello, People told him, don't build a plantation on infertile ground where the land is uneven. He did it anyway because he wanted it there, you know? When he died, he was $2 million in debt. He was in debt his entire life. And a lot of his debt accumulated because he had very expensive tastes and habits. He liked to invent things, you know? Which took a lot of materials, and he had to study. He liked to read books, which were expensive. He liked to drink wine, which was expensive. He liked to wear nice clothing, which was expensive. There's nothing he loved more than to build an edifice at Monticello, admire it, then tear it down and build another one. You know, that was his idea of fun. He had super expensive tastes, and he never made enough money to pay for it. So he was always in debt, and he often came up with kind of crazy schemes to try and get out of debt. One of his schemes was the Jefferson Lottery. The state of Virginia made a special exemption from its law to allow Thomas Jefferson to run a lottery to retire his debt. Buy a lottery ticket and help Thomas Jefferson out of his debt. And it didn't work. When Jefferson died, $2 million in debt. Everything was sold. All his livestock, all his equipment, his enslaved servants, they were sold. Monticello itself, his inventions were sold. Monticello itself was sold for $250,000 in today's money. $250,000 in today's money. So Jefferson had a reputation for being profligate, for being undisciplined, for being, in the early 19th century America, a hard-working, where the work ethic was very much ingrained in us. It made Jefferson not just seem to be a little irresponsible, but almost immoral. There was a hint, there was a whiff of immorality about Jefferson that everybody kind of acknowledged, but they didn't quite know how to square with his, small farmer virtuous ideals. And then at the same time, of course, that there's this hint of Jefferson being profligate and irresponsible. There's also this hint or rumor circulating throughout the country that he was an old dirty pervert who had sex with his slaves. That was a rumor in his own day. Every American heard the rumor. Everyone did. Some Americans believed it, most did not, or most chose to ignore it. But the rumors were around from just about the time when he became famous during the American Revolution after the Declaration of Independence, and then they really skyrocketed in the 1780s and 1790s. One of the most compelling kind of testimonies about Jefferson was written by James Callender in 1802. He wrote this: "It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor keeps, and for many years past has kept, as his concubine, one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally." And here's a cartoon that would come out a couple years later that would get wide circulation. It's called The Philosophic Cock. And there is Jefferson, who's, who has kind of pretensions to high-mindedness and philosophy, but really, he's just a dirty old rooster having sex with Sally Hemings, who's the hen here in this image. And that was kind of his reputation. There were rumors abounded about him and Sally in particular. I should say, and I think I forgot to mention this, because I think this is super relevant. In Jefferson's day, and I think throughout his life, if you were a slave owner and you were in debt, if you emancipated your slave, it went to your creditor. So slaves did not get freedom. I think toward the end of Jefferson's life, Virginia passed a law that if you emancipated your slave, the slave went to the state. and the state would auction the slave. So the only really option you had if you want to emancipate your slaves is to let them run away or help them escape. And Jefferson did that. We don't know. We get a sense that he probably covered up for allowing some slaves to escape, but we're not quite sure of the number. Since the eruption of the controversy, there have been some discoveries in diaries from the 19th century of people who visited Monticello, who noted the rumors that were circulating. Here's one that was discovered not too long ago. It's from a diary of Elijah Fletcher. He wrote it in 1811 after visiting Monticello. He was from New England. And he said, Republicans as well as Federalists in his own county dislike him and tell many anecdotes, much to his disgrace. I confess I never had a very exalted opinion of his moral conduct, but from the information I gained of his neighbors, who must best know him, I've a much poorer one. The story of Black Sal is no farce. That he cohabits with her and has a number of children by her is a sacred truth. And the worst of it is he keeps the same children slaves, an unnatural crime which is very common in these parts. So this was the rumor for centuries. This was the rumor. Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, but no historian, and I really mean, I'm trying to think, Fawn Brodie, you wouldn't really call her well, I guess she is a historian. Very few, if any, historians ever took it seriously until this historian. And what bothers me about her name is Annette Gordon Reed. I tell ya, she's the worst. You know why? She's a lawyer. Here she is, this lawyer, teaching law, who grew up greatly admiring Jefferson, and she decided she's just going to waltz into this field that so many of us have done PhDs in and spent years, digging in the archives, writing about. She's just going to come in and view the evidence as an attorney and see whether in civil court Thomas Jefferson would be found father of Sally Hemings' children. And she wrote this book that came out in 1997, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. And with this book, she rewrites the history of our country. I mean, she absolutely rewrites the history of Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if there's another book that does it like this. She comes out of nowhere, and she's not a historian, she's an attorney. It drives me nuts. It's such a wonderful book. It's so smartly written. She's so good with her use of evidence. She's absolutely thorough. This took her years and years and years to write. And she's written subsequent follow-ups to it. I greatly admire, all jokes aside, the work that she's done. And she has, not only has she done the work and made the case, she's extremely skillful at incorporating criticism and, not just kind of refusing criticism, but having her view of Jefferson and Sally Hemings evolve. So here's what she does. As an attorney in this book, she takes the case and she looks at the evidence. And she looks at evidence from three different areas. Number one, eyewitness testimony at Monticello. She first tries to find any testimony from Thomas Jefferson's family itself, and she finds very little. Because Jefferson, when all these rumors were circulating, when all these accusations were being made, Thomas Jefferson never responded, never said a peep, and instructed his family never to say a peep, never respond to the accusations. And nobody ever did respond until the 1850s when this woman, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, decided to break her silence, and she said something like this. She wrote something like this. Everybody knows that Sally Hemings had 6 children with a white man. Everybody knows that these 6 children look remarkably like my grandfather, and they did. They were a picture of Jefferson. I'm here to say my grandfather was not the father of Sally Hemings' children. Rather, this man was, Peter Carr. Peter Carr was Thomas Jefferson's nephew. He was Jefferson's son. He was the son of Jefferson's sister. Now, it helped when Ellen made this accusation. It helped that Peter Carr was dead. And it also helped that nobody liked Peter Carr. He was a gambler, he was a drunk, he was a womanizer, he was a known, went to prostitutes a lot. Nobody liked him. Everybody knew he was a dissolute jerk. And so everybody believed absolutely that he could have been the father of Sally Hemings' children. She said of him, he was the most notorious good-natured Turk, which was like a word for savage, that was ever master of a black seraglio. I had to look up the word seraglio. A brothel. I think it's a brothel. He was the master of a black seraglio kept at other men's expense. A dissipated young man who sought the society of mulletresses. That's what Ellen Randolph Coolidge had to say. So this was the story within the Jefferson family through the 20th century. Peter Carr was the father. And then Annette Gordon Reed consulted the Hemings family oral tradition and history. And it wasn't just the black families who lived at Monticello, the stories that were passed down, but also some of the other white families in the neighborhood. And this oral tradition said that Jefferson was the father. And it was like common knowledge that Jefferson was the father of of Sally Hemings' kids. And it was put in an explicit form in Madison Hemings' memoir. Madison Heming was a carpenter in Ohio, Chillicothe, Ohio, and he was active in the Underground Railroad. He was an abolitionist, and in 1873, at age 68, he writes his memoir. And in his memoir, he lays it out. He said, I am the son of Thomas Jefferson. My mother was Sally Hemings' slave. Here are the other people who are also children of Jefferson and Hemings. And here's what he was like. Here's what my father was like. Here's how he treated me. Here's how he treated my siblings. And here's how he related to my mom. It's really, really cool. I mean, he says that. I think what's fetching about his story is he says, don't think that my father raped my mother. They were in love. They were husband and wife in everything but name. They had a relationship for 38 years that was deeply loving. And because he said, my mother reminded Jefferson of his dead wife. And that was the bond, that was the attraction that started this bond that lasted their lifetimes. I love this piece, this straight historical document. It's a census page from 1870. Census takers would go around house to house and they would find out information, how many people lived there, when were they born. And here is a census taker in Chillicothe, Ohio. He writes down Madison Hemings, age 65. He's a farmer. He's born in Virginia. And then in the notes section, he writes this, the census taker, he's not allowed to do this. He writes, this man is the son of Thomas Jefferson, with an exclamation point. So I think it goes to show you how kind of common knowledge it was, at least in Ohio, that the Hemings family were all related directly to Thomas Jefferson. Another source of information that Annette Gordon Reed studied were Thomas Jefferson's farm records. Jefferson was an obsessive record keeper about his farm. He took note of every seed that was planted, every crop that was harvested, every visitor who came to Monticello, when they arrived and when they left, every child born at Monticello, and there were hundreds because he had so many slaves. Every child was duly noted, date of birth, the mother, and the father. Hundreds of slave children. The father is listed, except for 6. Sally's. He does not list Sally's father. And Annette Gordon Reed thinks that that's suspicious. What she also thinks is suspicious is that when Jefferson's farm book was published in 1953 by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, they deliberately left out and removed every mention of Sally Hemings, as if it was a cover-up. And then she did this. She tried to see, because Jefferson was such a great record keeper, she tried to see if Jefferson was with Sally every time she conceived. I think that Sally conceived 7 times. I think she had a child die, stillborn. She had 6 born children, and 4 of them made it to adulthood. But I think she conceived 7 times. And Annette Gordon Reed studied to see, was Jefferson with her every time she conceived, and saw that yes, he was. He was with her. So that was a strong indication that he could have been the father. And then the last bunch of evidence that she studied was how Sally Hemings' children were treated, how the whole Hemings family was treated. And they were treated fundamentally differently from every other slave at Monticello. They were given privileges that others weren't given. They were given violin lessons. They were given better clothes. They had better food. They had better jobs. They got educated in how to read and write. They were allowed to escape, and a few of them were emancipated. This strongly indicated that for some powerful reason, Sally Hemings and her offspring were special to Jefferson. Why was that? The book came out. It made a stir. It caused a lot of controversy. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation denied it. Most historians denied that this could have been true. And then, lo and behold, a couple years later, this thing called Y chromosome DNA testing came about. This Y chromosome DNA testing will test. It will test whether you have the Y chromosome of a father in your past. So the Y chromosome DNA is only passed from father to children, and then the son only passes it further down. So it's only passed from fathers to sons, fathers to sons, fathers to sons. Mitochondrial DNA is through the matrilineal line, but Y chromosome DNA is through the paternal line. So this was an easy test. All you have to do is get a male descendant of Thomas Jefferson and a male descendant of Sally Hemings and see if they were a Y chromosome DNA match. And they were. 99.9%. I mean, it's pretty open and shut. That it had to be a Jefferson. And more importantly, it could not have been Peter Carr, because Peter Carr was the son of Jefferson's sister. So it would not have been inherited through Peter Carr. That Y chromosome had to be inherited either from Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph. And when you go to Randolph, when he was at Monticello, he was not there when Sally conceived. So he could not have been the father. The father has to be Thomas Jefferson. When this news broke, I do remember the media contacted a bunch of people whose last names were Jefferson or Hemings, and they reported, Thomas Jefferson really was your ancestor. And this guy named John Jefferson said, I've known it practically all my life. You don't have to tell me. And what I think was revealed over the several years after this revelation about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, I think what came to light or became highlighted in the historical profession of the study of the Old South was how common this was. This was not unusual. Jefferson was not an isolated case. This was part of everyday life in the Old South. Abolitionists had long said that. Here's a painting from New England from probably the 1820s depicting Virginia luxuries. On the one hand, the one luxury is you get to use corporal punishment on a slave. On the other is you could have sexual favors from a slave. So this was part of everyday life in the Old South. that nobody ever talked about. And how common this was, I think, and how odd this was. How odd it seems to us. That's what I should say. How odd it seems to us is brought out by just studying Sally's own lineage. And I thought I would go through it kind of quickly. Pay attention. It gets complicated. Sally Hemings' grandmother was Susanna Epps, or Eppes. Susanna was born in West Africa. She was transferred across the Atlantic, and she was sold to the Eppes family in Williamsburg, Virginia. In 1735, an English sea captain named John Hemings came to Williamsburg, had sex with Susanna, and they had a baby, Betty. It seems as if Captain John Hemings was in love with Susanna, because he wanted desperately to buy her, and he also wanted to buy his daughter, Betty. But the Eppes family would not sell, and so Betty Hemings remained in the Eppes family, and she became a lady maid of a daughter in the Eppes family named Martha. So Betty and Martha, they're almost exactly the same age, but Betty is the slave, Martha is the slave owner or the mistress, and Betty becomes kind of Martha's best friend and personal slave. Martha marries a man named John Wales, and so now Betty, because John's a man, Betty becomes property of John, technically, but Betty still remains Martha Eppes' lady maid. John and Martha would go on to have a bunch of children together, and then John and Betty would go on to have a bunch of children together. John would have a daughter also named Martha, and through Betty, with Betty, they would have, I believe, 7 children, and the youngest of whom was Sally Hemings. Wow. This young Martha Wales, Sally, would become Martha Wales' personal lady maid. She was Martha's half-sister, but she was also her slave, and she was the personal lady maid of Martha Wales. Martha Wales marries Thomas Jefferson. The two of them have 6 children, and Jefferson and Sally have 6 children. Wow. Think about that. He has 6 children with his wife, and then he has 6 children with his wife's half-sister that he doesn't publicly acknowledge. These children are 7/8 white. They have one great-grandmother from Africa. That's it. This is beyond interesting. I think it's fascinating. Martha, we don't know much about Martha Jefferson. We do know that we know a couple things. First of all, Thomas Jefferson adored her. This was a very happy marriage. They loved each other deeply. Absolutely simpatico. We also know that she was not in great health, even though she got pregnant 6 times and had 6 children. It was the 6th pregnancy that did her in. She never recovered from it, and she died at age 33. Wow. As she was dying, she did 2 things that we know of. One, she gave her little sister, Sally, a bell and said, "Don't be too sad whenever you feel like you miss me," because Sally worshiped Martha. They were sisters. Sally worshiped Martha. Martha adored Sally. And Sally said, "Don't cry. When you miss me, just ring the bell and it'll remind you of me." And you could see this bell at Monticello today. The other thing that Martha did is she called Thomas in, and get this, she made Thomas promise never to remarry. That's a big ask in the 18th century. But he did. She said, don't remarry, because she was raised by a stepmother and they never got along. So she never wanted to impose a step-parent on their children. So she asked Thomas not to remarry, and he promised that he wouldn't, and he never did. When Martha died, Thomas was absolutely distraught. He was near suicidal. I mean, he could not get over it. And somebody thought that it would be a good idea, as the American War of Independence was coming to an end, and as we needed representation in Paris to represent American interests in France, they thought that Jefferson would be good for the job. And they also thought that it might help Jefferson's friends did, it might help Jefferson get over the death of his wife. And so he was offered the job to be a diplomat in Paris, and he took it. In 1784, he went to Paris and he loved it. The biggest city Jefferson had ever been to before that was Philadelphia, which was the largest city in the country, 40,000 people. Paris had 800,000 people. It was the absolute center of cultural and intellectual life in Europe, and Jefferson gloried in it. If you go to Paris today, you will see a lot of plaques and statues commemorating Jefferson's 5 years in Paris. That's all he spent there, but man, he made a lot of friends and made a big impact on the French, and they made a big impact on him. He was there for 2 years. He asked his daughter to come over and live with him. She arrived, her name is Polly, with her lady maid that she had inherited from her mother, named Sally Hemings. Sally was 14 years old. Sally also brought her older brother, James, who's a really interesting guy. There should be a book written about him. Jefferson began to educate James and Sally, teaching them French, having them take classes to perfect their accents, teaching them classical European literature. James showed some interest in cooking, and so Jefferson sent James to a culinary institute, the best one in Paris, to get a certificate as a French-trained chef. When James returned to the United States, he became known as the greatest chef in the country, and he was. Certainly the most highly educated chef. So this was odd, how Jefferson is treating these slaves. It seems that when Sally turned 16, Jefferson began a romantic relationship with her. And that's when she got pregnant for the first time. As their time in Paris was coming to an end, in 1789, Jefferson was being called back to New York and Philadelphia to be our first Secretary of State. And Jefferson said, okay, well, we've got to pack up the household, we've got to move back, and told Sally and James to, get ready to move back. But what happened right before they moved back was the French Revolution. And the first thing that the French did with the new revolutionary government was abolish slavery. Oh boy. So Jefferson says, Sally, James, let's go back. And they said, no, we're free. Why would we go back? We're free here. So it took weeks of Jefferson negotiating. This is going to sound sexist, but I have a tough time believing that 16-year-old Sally really put up a fight with Thomas Jefferson. I think it was the older brother, James, who said, screw you, old man, I've got a good job here, I'm a free man, and I'm going to stay in France. He absolutely, and Jefferson makes note of this, like, boy, James is really working on his French. I think he wanted to stay there. And he convinced Sally too. So I think James and Thomas Jefferson negotiated for weeks the conditions under which Sally and James would return to America. And the conditions were this. Sally said this, I do not want to bring a slave child into the world. Thomas said, I will emancipate your child when they're an adult, and I'll emancipate all the children that you may have after that. I'll treat you like free people. I will pay you for your work. You'll be able to continue to get an education, and we will not live the life of a slave. So they agreed to come back, and they did. Eventually, Thomas would allow James to escape. He would tell James, you could escape, but you have to train another chef just as good as you. So he trained his brother Peter. And Sally and Thomas would go on and live together another 38 years at Monticello. Wow. And they would have 6 children, 4 of whom would live to adulthood. And these are the children. There was Beverly, who was the oldest to live to adulthood. He was taught violin, he was a carpenter. He just walked away from Monticello in 1822. Nobody stopped him. He married a white woman, probably in Washington, D.C., and probably changed his name, and he lived the rest of his life as a white person. Following Beverly was his younger sister, Harriet. These are descriptions of her from people who knew her. She was near white and very beautiful, never did any hard work. She ran away in 1822 with $50 in hand. She was not pursued. She passed as white, probably connected with her older brother in Washington, D.C., and last was heard from in 1863. Then there was Madison Hemmings, the man I talked about before, who wrote his memoir in 1873. Madison says, and this is according to him, he said, my father, oddly, never showed much interest in me. Said he showed a lot of interest in my siblings, especially in my younger brother Easton, but not so much in me. But he did give me good education. I learned how to play violin. I was emancipated. He was emancipated in Jefferson's will. He moved to Ohio. He became very active and well known as a citizen in Chillicothe, Ohio. He was an abolitionist and worked in the Underground Railroad. And then his younger brother Easton, who was emancipated in 1826, he may have been Jefferson's favorite. He was over 6 feet tall, very erect and dignified. His nearly straight hair showed a tint of auburn. He was quiet, unobtrusive, polite, and decidedly intelligent. He would be emancipated. He would go on to have 10 children. He would move to Madison, Wisconsin, because he became convinced that there were slave catchers trying to catch him and return him to the South, and that was probably true. So he moved to Madison, Wisconsin, further away from the Mason-Dixon line, and changed his last name to Jefferson. They would go, so 2 of Jefferson's kids lived as black people and remained in the black community. 2 of his kids lived as white people and disappeared into the white community. They would have, the ones we know about would go on to have kids of their own. Here's John Wales Jefferson. He would be a colonel in the Union Army. He's Easton's son. Ellen Wales Roberts, she said, I think, and I quote, I would take a bullet for my grandfather, Thomas. Beverly Jefferson, also extremely proud that his grandfather was Thomas Jefferson. I have to credit the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which helps to run Monticello. They hold now family reunions at Monticello, and you can see the black faces and the white faces all mingled together. Where does this leave us, though, with Jefferson? Is he just a creepy hypocrite? No, yeah, I agree. No, I don't see it that way. History is complicated. I think Jefferson was trapped in a world he didn't make that prevented him and tortured him because he was unable to live the life that he believed in. He had beliefs and thoughts that did not square with the life he was living. And I think that really helps to explain his dark turn with respect to slavery. He saw slavery as almost like Lincoln would see it, as something that, yes, it was doomed, but it's going to do a lot of damage and tear this country apart because there's no way it could end peacefully. He said this during the Missouri crisis when Missouri petitioned for admission to the Union as a slave state. and the Civil War was, a Civil War was narrowly averted. This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. We have the wolf by the ears, the wolf being slavery, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in the one scale and self-preservation in the other. He also wrote this shortly after. The public mind will not yet bear a proposition of abolition. Yet the day is not distant when it must bear and adopt it, or worse will follow. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. I think we have to think about Jefferson when he's writing about slavery and the damage that it does to slave owners. He's writing about himself. And yes, I think that absolutely complicates his legacy, deepens his legacy, but it does not diminish in the least his greatness or significance to our country. Thank you. I've gone long over, so I just want to say I'm going to be back in 3 weeks from today, talking about World War II. I'll see you then.